All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unraveling a pretty massive geopolitical mystery. We are going to trace exactly how a conflict in the Middle East managed to absolutely drain the tax coffers thousands of miles away in Berlin. We're looking at a crazy domino effect, one that bridges global energy, high-stakes military standoffs, and some very public, very real fractures between historic allies. If you want to understand how a localized conflict spirals into a global economic crisis, well, you're in the right place. Let's get straight to the numbers.
So check out the sheer scale of this number. 70 billion euros. That's a 7 with 10 zeros. This represents the massive cut German officials just had to make to their projected tax revenues for the years 2026 through 2030. That is an enormous financial shock to any nation's budget, let alone the largest economy in Europe. We're not talking about a slight accounting adjustment here. This is a massive fiscal blow, and it's the shock that kicks off the entire global domino effect we're looking at today. So what exactly caused a 70 billion euro hole in Germany's future budget?
Well, to answer that, we just have to look at the words of Germany's finance minister, Lars Klingbeil. He explicitly blamed this budget crisis on what he called a global energy shock that directly resulted from the war in Iran. Just to recap, on February 28th, the US and Israel launched a war against Iran, an action that Germany and several other European countries have been pretty highly critical of. So Klingbeil's drawing a straight line here. He's saying the conflict in the Middle East is fundamentally harming their domestic economy. And this is exactly why this matters to us, no matter where we live. It brilliantly illustrates just how tightly woven our modern global economy really is. A war in one hemisphere can literally slash the public spending capacity of a country in another.
All right, moving into Section 1, the Strait of Hormuz shock.
So what is the actual physical bottleneck that's causing this massive economic shock? It's all about that 20% slice. Roughly 20% of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas usually passes right through the Strait of Hormuz. But right now, that strategic shipping route has been effectively closed off by Iran. Now, when you suddenly choke off 1/5 of the entire global fuel supply, global fuel prices are obviously going to soar. And for Germany, this was the perfect storm. Their economy has actually been stagnant for years, heavily burdened by weak demand for exports and energy costs that were already sky high. So when this Strait of Hormuz shock hit, it basically crushed their export-heavy economic model, which directly led to that 70 billion euro shortfall we just talked about.
Which brings us to Section 2, a transatlantic divide.
Now, when you're dealing with this kind of intense economic pressure cooker, soaring energy costs paired with plummeting revenues, the diplomatic temperature is absolutely bound to rise. And over the span of just a few days, a very public war of words completely fractured the US-German alliance. It started with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz criticizing US strategy. That triggered an immediate online response from President Donald Trump, and all of that culminated in a swift, highly consequential military decision from the Pentagon. Let's break down exactly what was said, starting with Chancellor Merz.
While addressing students last month, Chancellor Merz delivered some really sharp criticism. He bluntly stated that the Americans clearly have no strategy, adding that he couldn't even see what strategic exit they might choose. He expressed this deep frustration with the diplomatic process, pointing out that Iranian negotiators were letting Americans travel all the way to Islamabad, only to leave without any results at all. In Merz's view, this meant the entire nation of the US was being humiliated by the Iranian leadership. He's been quite vocal lately that Trump's policies have fundamentally changed the traditionally close US-Europe relationship, even mentioning earlier this year that a deep divide has opened up between them.
Now, the crucial point here is the direct contrast in perspectives, because the very next day after Merz made those remarks, President Trump fired right back on Truth Social. Trump asserted that Merz thought it was okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon and claimed the chancellor doesn't know what he's talking about. Trump pointed directly to Germany's economic struggles, posting, "No wonder Germany is doing so poorly." He then suggested Merz should spend less time interfering with those trying to get rid of the Iran nuclear threat and more time fixing his own broken country, especially immigration and energy. So we're simply looking at the stark reality of how these two leaders are publicly clashing over a really critical global security issue.
Now let's look at Section 3, the troop withdrawal.
You see, this diplomatic spat didn't just stay on social media or in student town halls. It had very real, boots-on-the-ground military consequences. 5,000 troops, to be exact. Just days after Chancellor Merz's initial comments about the U.S. lacking a strategy, the U.S. Defense Department actually announced a plan to withdraw 5,000 troops from Germany. This order has been widely attributed to U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
To really understand the impact of a cut like that, we have to zoom out and look at the history. The U.S. military deployment in Germany has traditionally been, by far, its biggest footprint in Europe. Now, even with this withdrawal, the U.S. does maintain significant forces across the continent. We're talking about 12,000 troops in Italy and another 10,000 in the U.K. But pulling 5,000 troops out of Germany, that is a massive shift in the strategic landscape of the NATO alliance. President Trump has obviously been a longtime critic of NATO, and he's been berating allies recently for not joining his plans to forcefully reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
So how did Berlin react to this major military withdrawal? Well, Germany's defense minister simply called the Pentagon's decision a foreseeable one. There wasn't this massive public outrage. It was more like a resigned acceptance that the relationship had deteriorated so much that troop cuts were just the expected next step in this whole diplomatic domino effect.
Let's bring this to the present in Section 4, Stalled Negotiations.
So where exactly does this complex web of economic shock, diplomatic rows, and military posturing stand today? Well, we're currently stuck in a deeply gridlocked situation. First off, the warring sides are observing a ceasefire right now, which is theoretically meant to lead to a deal to end the conflict. Second, President Trump stated on Wednesday that the war would be over quickly. Third, Iran says it's actively considering a U.S. proposal to end the war. But here is the real sticking point. Negotiations have completely stalled. Why? Because the U.S. has imposed a blockade on Iranian ports. They're essentially trying to force open the Strait of Hormuz at the exact same time.
And that brings us to a frankly staggering reality on the ground, or rather, on the water. 2,000 stranded ships. That is the number of commercial vessels currently stuck in the Gulf, trapped there since February. They're just desperately waiting for the Strait of Hormuz to open back up so they can pass through unharmed. Just imagine the global supply chain implications of that many ships sitting completely paralyzed. It's wild. This right here is the physical, real-world manifestation of that 70 billion euro hit to Germany we talked about at the beginning.
So we have to wrap up with this thought. With 2,000 cargo and energy ships literally stranded in the water, a 70 billion euro hole blown into the German economy, and historical transatlantic alliances fracturing in real time, what is it actually going to take to break this global gridlock? Are we going to see military pressure force the strait open, or will diplomatic concessions finally untangle this massive geopolitical logjam? It is a domino effect that is literally still falling right in front of us, and it's something we're going to be watching very, very closely. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.